Welcome. Thank you so much for joining this session. It's totally a pleasure to be up here on the stage. And what we're going to do is crack open something that we are calling the step back. Basically, and whether you're looking here locally, around the nation, around the globe, we are increasingly seeing examples of communities really rethinking land use in a changing climate. Whether that's from rising seas or flooding, drought, heat, fires, these processes of retreat are increasingly happening. And I think as all of us know, when it comes to the step back, it is the part of adapting to a changing climate that might be as complicated and difficult as it gets. So we have a dynamo series of panelists here who are going to reflect on what is happening right now. Is anything good unfolding when it comes to our emerging step back from the water's edge? What can we take in terms of lessons for the future? And we're also going to try to think hard about innovations that might enable us to better tap the opportunities of the step back. So I will briefly introduce each speaker and then pose a question. We all came together to really think about what questions most get at the heart of the issue, help crack open the challenges and the opportunities of the great step back. But we're also encouraging this to be a lively discussion, so please think about your own questions for the panelists as we go. We'll be building in a lot of time for discussion at the end. And we're also encouraging each other to interrupt and raise provocative points or points of support. So kicking it off, we will start with Colette Pichon Battle. She is partner of vision and initiatives at the Taproot Earth Global Climate Justice Organization. Previously the founder and executive director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy for over 17 years, she is now a Southern Movement Assembly Governance Council member, co-chair of the National Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus with Policy Link, and an Ocean Justice Forum Steering Committee member, as well as a lead architect for Gulf South for a Green New Deal. Her recognitions are multifaceted and numerous. I'll mention just a few. She was the 2022 recipient of the William Douglas Award and also a recipient of Rachel's Network Catalyst Award. She was also an Obama Fellow in 2019. Okay, yeah, love it. Feel free to react at any point in time. So, the step back is already happening in some locations. And Colette, can you kick off by describing what this has been like in Louisiana, a place where our current step back interacts with, frankly, decades and centuries of experiences with resettlement and relocation? And what have the experiences of Indigenous communities been? And also, why are we seeing emerging resistance to these processes of retreat?
Thank you so much. Peace, y'all. I'm Colette. I use she, her. I reside in the territory of the Choctaw Nation on the North Shore of New Orleans, and it's such an honor to be here. I want to say to folks standing in the back, there's chairs over here, just making sure I help manage the room. And, and now you know my personality. I like to just dominate rooms. Anywho, this is such a personal topic because my family, the Pichon family, has been where it is since the 1770s, since before it was the United States of America. We are a Creole community that mixed with a Native community, and there's a very complicated story of Louisiana that we can talk about over a strong drink. But the point is, we've been there for a long time, and we're right on the lake, and we are one of the communities who will be lost to sea level rise no matter what we do. So no matter what happens, no matter what technology we use, some communities are already gone because the way sea level rise happens, it's going to take a while to see, but you can predict, and the flood maps have predicted the eradication, the erasure of my community. And my community is not the only community. The worst hit right now are our tribal communities down in the south of Louisiana. So if you can think about the boot, Louisiana is the shape of a boot. The very bottom of that boot are 6 parishes down right on the water, and those parishes are losing land at one of the fastest rates on the planet. We compete with Bangladesh for land loss. And if you think about Bangladesh and you think about the land at South Louisiana, you understand we're at the bottom of a river system, right? So some of you come from places where there's bedrock or something underneath. I come from a place where when you step on the ground, you can feel it, you can bounce on it. I think South Florida might be aware of what I'm speaking about. But so anyway, the land itself has to be replenished by a river. But we've levied that river, and we started putting levees around that river to protect property. That is the basis of the levee system, and no other reason. It's not like an agricultural levee or anything like that. And the sea levels are rising, so land is sinking in places like New Orleans, not because people built terribly and made bad choices, but because when you put levees around a city, it actually starts to sink. You can ask any engineer about the land, this kind of land with cement all around it. And when you go outside the levee system in South Louisiana, you see the sea levels are rising, and they're rising to the point now where we're already seeing relocation. Louisiana was the first recipient of federal dollars for climate relocation due to sea level rise. Unfortunately, we live in a country that makes these things competitions. So there was a competition to get a grant to try the relocation process. And the two finalists were South Louisiana and Alaska. So two tribal communities in places where we're really seeing land loss. The biggest part, of course, to your eyes, is the amount of land we're going to lose. That is absolutely the most unbelievable thing you'll ever see. Land just disappearing. Doesn't make any sense to your brain. Even when you just say it, you kind of get it. The part that you don't see is what happens to the communities. The communities break down. The networks that are able to exist in places where incomes are very low. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about. You know, how do poor people survive? Many poor people survive based on their community networks. And in South Louisiana, they survive based on their access to natural ecosystems that can feed them. So a lot of times you can get your protein in South Louisiana for free. There's just fish everywhere. There's crawfish everywhere. There's shrimp everywhere. If you don't believe me, you should come see. That's how much we have. We have enough for you. But it's everywhere. But it's also, if you don't have enough money, you can feed yourself. You can manage your household. You might have to buy eggs, but you can get fish. Well, when you relocate people away from those waters, when you relocate people away from that very easy access to protein, you're now increasing the amount of money they have to have access to. And people don't think about these kinds of things, but you see it in disaster, right? When people move somewhere for disaster, all of a sudden you have to buy everything. You used to be able to go to your neighbor and ask for something. You used to be able to, go to your garden. And these are the pieces of relocation we're not really thinking about. I live in St. Tammany Parish on the North Shore, where we're starting to see movement from the lower parishes, just one parish up. So you're not seeing you are seeing some people move 12 states away, but mostly you're seeing people move 30 miles away, and then another 40 miles away. And you're starting to see this sort of trend. The sad news is folks are really starting to make money off of the relocation, right? So we're starting to see development being marketed specifically to Black and poor people who are first-time home buyers, and saying, oh, here's a home, but they're not telling them their home is in a flood zone. By the time they finish paying off their 30-year mortgage, their house will be worth nothing. They're not telling them any of that, and if you're not paying attention to climate change, these aren't things that you're even thinking about. And so I just offer these things, Katie, as like some of the dots that are moving, and I think the biggest dot that I've had to really wrestle with is, as an organizer, as a lawyer, my job is to, try to help, try to fix things, try to make it work. And you think your job is to say, hey, y'all, we got to get out the way. We got to move. We've got to prepare for what is coming. And that was the general sentiment. It was a very sad sentiment. Can you imagine having to actually part from your land that is the basis of your identity? I mean, we literally introduce ourselves by what bayou we're on. I'm from Bayou Liberty. Like, if I say that, you know exactly where I'm from, and you know exactly what family I'm from. Well, what we're seeing now are folks who are having to not just think about moving, but they're watching, in the process of relocation, they're watching private industry pay for what the government won't. So in Ile-de-Jean-Charles in South Louisiana, the first place that got those federal dollars, they've successfully started moving the tribe off of that island, Ile-de-Jean-Charles, and private sportsman companies have come in and paid for the road that the government said they would not repave. They've paid for the emergency services that the government said they would not pay for. So now private industry has taken this island and has now made it a recreation camp, while the tribal members have been moved and their livelihoods and their networks have been destroyed. We're starting to hear the tribes now say things like, we are not leaving. We are not going to leave. This is another failed attempt of the United States to move us off of our land. We are resisting. And what do? Do you say don't resist? Well, when you understand your job as an organizer, you understand your job is not to control anybody. It's to get folks to really activate and access their own self-determination, and that's really what we're seeing. So the resistance is coming. I can't blame folks. It's, the way the government rolls out these programs is a little shady, in my opinion, and not shady because they're bad people, just shady because we don't have systems that care about humanity. We don't have systems that care about human dignity. We have systems that say move 12 people to 12 units, and that's how we think about these things. So we're starting to see the tribal community say we don't recognize the authority of the United States. We're not leaving our land. There's nowhere else to go. I mean, the rest of, if you go any further south, you're in the ocean. And many tribes have declared that they will not leave. So we will see what this resistance looks like in the conversation of climate relocation.
Thank you, Colette. What a perfect way to kick off, really thinking about the way that the step back brings the past, the present, and the future into such sharp juxtaposition with, risks and loss and maybe also opportunities. And we'll come back to Colette for that a little bit later on. We'll now turn to our second speaker, also someone who needs no introduction in this room. It's an honor to have Nadege Green on stage. She is Director of Community Research and Storytelling at the Community Justice Project. She is a community historian and writer investigating how historical and contemporary local government policies impact everyday people. As you probably are aware, her work has appeared widely, for example, in the Miami Herald, The Atlantic, and on NPR. She's a senior civic media fellow at the University of Southern California's Annenberg Innovation Lab and has co-produced and reported extensively on climate gentrification for Miami. So let's turn to Miami. How do you see the step back unfolding here, and why has there been so much crucial focus on climate gentrification and displacement?
Sure. So is this on? Yes. Okay, good. I can't hear myself. So interestingly enough, in Miami, we talk a lot about Miami Beach, but you hear very little about the inland communities. And Miami is a place that was built on racism, right? Miami Beach was a sundown town for whites only. And when Miami was built out, even though black folks are the ones who cleared the land for Miami Beach to exist and most of the waterfront communities to exist, these were deed restricted areas that black folks could not live on. So black folks could not live along the waterfront. Black folks could not even access Miami Beach as a space of recreation. And so black folks were pushed to the west side of the railroad tracks. And obviously the railroad tracks are built in a space that does not flood because it's the railroad tracks. And so because of racism, black people in Miami lived on higher land and still do. But what happens when the water comes for the folks on Miami Beach? Then you want to go to the highland. That is not to say that people don't want to live on the beach anymore. Look around you. People still live here. There are new buildings going up still here on Miami Beach. But it is to say that people are looking very closely on what elevation means. So if you're house hunting in Miami, you want to know the elevation of where you're moving to, because that will determine your insurance rates. If you need flood insurance, that's an additional insurance in addition to the regular insurance, right? And so we're having language around, and it's really interesting what we do with language in Miami. So if you talk to activists, reporters, folks in the climate space, you will hear the term climate gentrification, which is largely has been credited to Jesse Keenan, who wrote the Harvard piece on climate gentrification here in Miami, right? Which speaks to not that this is happening only because of sea level rise, but that sea level rise is going to exacerbate gentrification that already was happening, because many of these black areas are also center city. And so we're seeing, just like we're seeing all over the country, that reverse suburban flight back into center city. So you see that in these neighborhoods, and in the same way that the ocean front has been an amenity, elevation is now an amenity in Miami. And so you hear climate gentrification in activist spaces, if you talk to city planners, you hear the term flood resilient. Neighborhoods that don't flood. It's the same thing, that we need more density in the flood resilient neighborhoods. We're still talking about these historically black communities that were built west of the railroad tracks. And so in Little Haiti, for example, which is, you've probably seen the headlines, the fastest gentrifying neighborhood in Miami is Little Haiti. It is a space, and it's almost a paradoxical space, because when you think about how Haitians came to Miami, many came by boat, by water, here, right? So the water brought you here, and you land in this space, and you make it home, and now the water's pushing you away from that home, but not because your area flood, but because the other areas are going to flood, right? And so you can't talk about Miami and displacement without interlaying that with the very real issue around the structural racism that this space is built on. And it's an uncomfortable conversation for some. Okay, but it's real. It is real. And also, I appreciate what Colette was just saying about also the networks, right, that eradicate when you move people. And I did a 3-part series with our local NPR station in WNYC called There Goes the Neighborhood, and it's about Little Haiti and climate gentrification. And I followed one man who was displaced in Little Haiti for about a year. And first, I showed up to, and I should also say that these areas were purposely disinvested. And so the property was cheaper in these neighborhoods. And so now that you have development coming in, the largest development coming into Little Haiti right now is called Magic City. In their plans that they submitted to the city, there is a topography map that speaks to the elevation of the space that they're going to be building in. And the fact that this is a good investment because it is flood resilient. Black and white. In a way that historically we have not seen that conversation happening around developments in Miami. It's happening now. So this isn't what's happening in the future, it's happening right now. On the ground, do people have the language around climate change? Not necessarily. You just know that your rent is going up, developers are coming into your neighborhood. Some folks understand, what the high ground means, some folks don't. They just know they're being displaced. And in this case, this gentleman lived in what we call here naturally occurring affordable housing, code for slum housing. It's cheap because it's bad. Right? I mean, there were holes, raccoons come in at night, rats fall from the ceiling, right? It is substandard. And we talk about climate change, we're also talking about housing. Substandard housing and climate goes together, right? And so he lived in this housing because it was cheap. But he also had pre-existing conditions, et cetera. But he's Haitian, and the Haitian community looks out for each other, right? And so if he's sick, the neighbor is going to make him soup. When someone dies in the Haitian community, we have a tea that we make. I call it the shock tea. It's vervain or vervain in Creole. But it's growing all over the neighborhood. Someone knows what plant to pick to boil the tea when you found out news that someone passed away to help ease that shock, right? But what happens when you displace him from this area where all of his healing ways and ways of knowing is gone? So he moved into an area about 30 minutes north of Little Haiti. He could not afford an apartment anymore. He moved into a room in someone's house, which is now a cottage industry in Miami, renting a room in someone's house, renting a shed. There are entire shed apartments in people's backyards with all kinds of electrical stuff. And it's a hazard, right? When it catches fire, it is a hazard. But that is real because of the housing crisis here. But every day he would get on the bus to come to Little Haiti, even though he was now about 30, 40 minutes away, because this is what he knew. This is where community was. But the question begs, what happens when he can't get on the bus anymore? What is the life outcome for the folks who are displaced? We are not tracking displacement and where people go. And certainly we are not talking about the heartbreak of what it means to interrupt someone's network. Mothers who have free babysitters because the neighbors know them. Who's gonna watch your kids when the neighbors don't know you? Right? All of these parts are not talked about when we talk about what displacement means. And specifically in Miami, what being on higher elevation means in neighborhoods like Liberty City as well, which is a predominantly African-American community, but just like Haitians, same type of network, right? Very tight-knit. It's the most southern of the southern. We talk in Miami, in Little Haiti, and Liberty City, we say good morning in a way that no one will talk to you on Miami Beach, right? Like someone's gonna offer you some food. They're gonna hype you up. I see you, girl, like walking down the street. Like that is the neighborhood, right? That is the love. And that built-in love disintegrates when you start seeing the shift. And we're seeing it here in Miami. And I'll just pause there. But when we talk about the displacement in Miami, we also have to talk about structural racism in Miami.
Thank you so much, Nadege, and I think it's just unambiguously the case that land use has always been about wealth accumulation, inequity, and racism, and I think kind of understanding all of the ways in which the step back steps right into that, really, really pivotally important. We'll next turn to Jake Bittle, who's a staff writer at Grist Environmental Magazine, where he covers climate impacts and adaptation. For many of you may have seen his recent book covered very extensively all over the media, The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Harper's Magazine. So when we were chatting just before the session today, Colette raised the point that this is a really rough topic, and there's some risk that all of you, in departing this room, may wish that it were stiff drinks awaiting you rather than coffee. So we're going to, as just a brief interlude here, try to see if we can flip the coin over and say, what does it mean to take the step back and start to think about doing it better? And as we'll get to in a few questions for now, even tapping some opportunities for radical transformation. So Jake, what does it take to support a step back, to manage retreat with all of the challenges even around that word management in a way that might be just and complete? And can you point to any successful examples to date?
Oh dear, I don't know how encouraging this answer is actually going to be. So I think we probably all agree, right, that all of us would agree that there's necessity for some kind of retreat. You have to move back from the riskiest areas, but I don't know that it's ever been done in a just way. I would welcome somebody to provide me with an example, but I think if you look at in this country, the primary way that we've done this is the FEMA home buyout program, right? Federal government will give a locality money, and that locality can give people money for the pre-flood value of their homes, right? So, your home got flooded, we give you the market value, and then you go somewhere else, right? So right off the bat, I think you could probably take issue with the program that gives people the market value of their homes, right? Because that reproduces the previously existing difference that gave people homes of differing values to begin with, right? So already that program, you could argue it's really not just, right? So then we don't really do any kind of post-payment monitoring in this country for what happens to people who get these payments. Sometimes they end up going into foreclosure on the next properties they own. Many times they end up moving into flood zones again. That's already that could be changed, right? But that's already another problem, right? Then you get into what Colette was talking about, right? And Nadege, where when you leave behind a community, there's all kinds of intangible things that the government doesn't even try to put into dollar terms, right? In some ways you can't. In other ways, it just gets erased, all that value, right? Which is impossible to replicate. So that's probably true to a greater or lesser extent for everybody in every community, although in certain communities, those are extremely valuable, parts of history and legacy. And then the last thing, right, is once you give somebody the requisite amount of money, where do they end up going, right? Even if you route them into a place that's safer, then you can get into a situation like what Nadege was describing, right, where you could imagine people with really, really flush payments from the government to leave a flood-prone area ending up in a really resilient area and causing some issues there, right? So I don't think it's been done in a just way, and I think the opportunity here is for us to think about what would it look like for this to be accomplished, for somebody to be given, the means to leave an area that they want to leave. How would you do that well, right? I think it starts probably with looking beyond property, which we don't really do in this country at all. And then you have to look way beyond just the process of moving from the riskiest area to the less risky area and think about the background, which is, lack of access to affordable housing, both in the places that are being retreated from and those that are being retreated to, right? So I guess the best way you could frame this answer is it's kind of like a provocation. I think people like being induced to think hard about this kind of stuff. So maybe that will make you a little bit more cheered up, if nothing else. But no, I don't think that the federal flood buyout program or the brief experiments that we've made into whole community relocation, like what Colette was describing, I don't think any of this has ever been done in anything close to a just way, right? And I think our challenge probably to think about how far are we from that, Yeah.
Great. And I think for all of us, we've been coming together as a group saying, what does it mean to potentially tap the opportunity? So we're going to come back to that, but we're going to have one more question really focusing on the hard parts of this issue. So Susan Crawford is the John A. Riley Clinical Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She previously was Obama's Special Assistant to the President for Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy, and led the FCC transition team between his and the Bush administrations. Earlier in her career, she was a partner at Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, and as an academic, she teaches in climate adaptation and public leadership. She also has authored multiple books, and stay tuned for her forthcoming book called Charleston, Race, Water, and the Coming Storm. So one response to the fact that the step back and retreat is a phenomenally difficult topic is to basically just avoid it, to kind of engage in a little bit of magical thinking, sweep it under the rug, what environmental psychologists sometimes call engage in motivated denial. But not talking about something that is happening and bears immense questions of justice and equity also has a whole lot of risks. So Susan, how do you see the implications of failing to talk about the step back, failing to plan, and letting the step back be unmanaged? Who will benefit and who will be harmed?
It is an honor to be here and especially to join in this room with really the grief of watching your land disappear. I think it's important to let that settle in our hearts. We have these completely mismatched systems where the velocity of sea level rise and extreme heat is hard for us to comprehend. At the same time, our puny, unorganized, ad hoc, volunteer efforts to even think about moving people or helping them to move, assisting them through the grieving process into a new place that is high and dry and well connected is completely not up to the scale of the challenge we face. 6 million additional houses should be in the floodplain than the FEMA maps reflect right now. Maps are completely inaccurate. We've so far, as a matter of just bureaucracy and federal movement, shifted 45,000 homes out of the 13 million, something like that, that's going to have to happen in the next few decades. And we're doing it in a cruel, incredibly prolonged, cheap, badly planned way. So, okay, that's the awful system on one side and the velocity of change on the other. It does seem to me that we are capable of great things. We're capable of reimagining systems. We are just beginning to recognize the structural racism that undergirds every part of our property system in America. Everything about this is about housing, really, and not treating housing as a human right, but rather as an investment. I happen to have just spent 5 years studying Charleston, which is like all of this in spades, where luxury housing is sailing up while, actually the whole place is going to be chronically inundated in a matter of years and decades, not centuries, and a complete reluctance to even talk about the need to leave. They could call it raging politeness in Confederate Disneyland. Raging politeness. And, there are structures that make that happen. The state of South Carolina requires cities to depend on property tax and requires cities to get a lot from tourism to fuel the rest of it. This is very true in Miami, too. And then at the federal level, there is no one waking up and saying, oh my God, we've got a huge problem. Instead, we have these puny, badly managed programs that are not coordinated and that really respond to disasters rather than planning ahead. So our challenge is to elect people who see this as a national priority and are ready to stand up and say we've got to be looking decades ahead. We did amazing things as a country just a few decades ago. We have not lost the money to do so. We've just lost the will, and we're extraordinarily polarized right now. But I do see opportunity. I remain hopeful. We have to, really, remain hopeful that our better selves and somebody in the federal government is able to fix a whole bunch of broken programs, align money, so this becomes much more like, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say there's only one good part of the American healthcare system, and it is hospice. That when you enter hospice, as Jimmy Carter just did, you get a lot of assistance and many people showing up to help out, all federally funded, and thinking about a huge variety of things as you go into a new phase of life, as your life ends. Why can't we treat this extraordinary move we're going to have to make as a country like that? That should be a huge reservoir of funding for it, a lot of local planning that goes into it, and kindness and compassion and decency at every step. I'll stop there. It's an honor to be here with you, really.
Okay, so we can hold on to that. We are capable of great things. Thank you, Susan. So we're going to flip back to Colette in this spirit of we are capable of great things. So stepping back from the water's edge, Colette, in what ways is that an opportunity for societal transformation? And most importantly, are we ready for it?
I struggle with the word opportunity in this conversation. I've struggled with it since Katrina, which is how everybody talked about South Louisiana. It was a great opportunity for a lot of people to get their PhDs and research us. It was an opportunity for a lot of people to get that first house that they wanted to have. It was this opportunity. And then they show me the Asian, script, see, that's opportunity and disaster. It's the same word. And you're like, I don't know if I can hear that right now. So I would like to talk in possibilities. Semantics, but it's just where I have to go for my own soul. Because I think this moment is really critical. I am someone who is of the South. I love the South. I'm a Southern girl through and through. But we have a legacy that we have to address. It is not just in the South. It's just where people acknowledge that it is, right? I won't talk about Massachusetts. I'm just going to say they got problems too. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say about it. But this is a moment of possibility. And it requires us to have a lot of courage to acknowledge what the harm that we have done is still doing. I mean, we're talking about housing, we're talking about food, we're talking about health. These are basic things. And we have a country that only in our Constitution speaks of water as a commodity, that never acknowledges the Declaration of Human Rights, that does not in any way ensure that dignity will be a part of disaster response or planning. It's not even there. We are rooted in a system, a westernized, capitalized system of numbers, dollars, and profit. And if we don't see this moment as bigger than that, then we will lose not just our souls, but our planet. And there's a conversation to be had about retreat. There's a conversation to be had about land use. There's a conversation to be had about all of this. But there's a bigger problem. And it is we are driving. We Americans maintaining an American economy, we are driving a global imbalance. And what we're talking about on this stage is a tiny fracture of what is happening to the planet. The problem is not just that the laws for where the houses go are wrong. They're wrong. We got to change them. There is an opportunity right now for us to actually connect with the global community and reach our highest level of human possibility if we choose to acknowledge past harm, if we choose and commit to value each other the same, and if we choose and really catalyze ourselves to show what power really is. Power is not just about who we elect. It's about what we stand for. And in this country, I mean, to watch what we are silent about is amazing to me. It just shows the comfort that we live in, right? That we can be quiet about so many things, including people getting killed protecting their land in Atlanta so that more cops and military don't come into their community. How can we be quiet in this moment where the rest of the planet is screaming, and they're not just screaming out as victims? When we go to those climate talks, and we go every year, the biggest obstacle that we face is the U.S. government. And the rest of the planet is asking us, can you please get your government to get out of the way of us trying to survive? We have a possibility, a moment of possibility, but it's going to require the courage to acknowledge past harm and how we go forward. We also have this moment of thinking outside of all of the boxes that we've been taught to think in. The truth of the matter is we've been miseducated. I'm sorry to be the one to break it to you. Everything you've learned is probably not exactly right. And it was meant to benefit a particular group of people, and you've pretty much based your whole life on their philosophy that's hurting us. So now you've got to come out of that. Now, what is this going to take, y'all? I think it's going to take crawfish and beer, but you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. You can do it your own way. I know there are vegans in the house. I'm sorry. We can have avocado toast and discuss the need for us to actually say, who thought to put avocado on toast in the first place? Like, what? Like, okay, so this is good because we got to start thinking out of the box. And thinking out of the box, it really starts with one thing. Well, it's two things. Does nature have its own rights? There is an indigenous movement to recognize the rights of nature, which means capitalist Americans. It doesn't just have a value because you use it. It has a value because God created it. Now, if you're willing to let yourself go there, you could go to many, many places. It could be a beautiful place. You could end up with avocado toast. You can end up with something unconventional that you never really thought of. The other thing we really have to think about is how we are understanding equity. The way we use the word equity, it says, we absolutely have to get some of these solutions. We've got to go. It's time to go, y'all. Everybody, all of us, everybody in here, political party does not matter in this moment. It's coming for all of us. So we need everybody. Now, when we get everybody together, we're going to have to say that the solutions we build for tomorrow have to acknowledge and repair the harm of yesterday in order for it to be considered a solution. Why are we putting billions of dollars in technology that doesn't work to pull carbon out of the air? Why are we doing that? We could actually fix housing. We could invest billions of dollars into housing, make it efficient, move people out of the way, and you would still reduce more greenhouse gases than any of those technologies would if they work. And there's no proof that they work. In fact, there's proof otherwise. Carbon capture, sequestration, utilization, hydrogen. The proof is that none of it works, and we just put billions of dollars into that without putting enough into housing and hospice. What? I didn't know that. Let's do that. I mean, like, if we have things that work, why aren't we investing in things that work? Why aren't we investing in reduction? Why aren't we investing in relocation that does have some dignity? Because the people on Ile de Jean Charles will tell you if there's one thing that whole process took from them was their dignity. We are still moving indigenous people off their land without dignity. Do y'all hear what I'm saying? How are we still there? Isn't that what happened at the beginning of the country? It's happening right now. Well, the possibility right now is for us to change. But I'm not sure we're ready. Because every time I talk to an American audience, there's always a question about what if, and doesn't this work? And can you prove to me the data and the stats? And can you show me this? But the only people who get to do that are privileged people. Because that's wasting time. And when you get to waste time like that, it's because you have time. It's because you have resources, because you can move yourself. You might not like it, but you can get out of the way. There are millions of people on the planet who cannot get out of the way. And I'm going to tell you the worst part of all of this. Our country drove the problem. Our country drove the problem globally. And we are blocking communities across the globe from getting any kind of help for what they've already lost. Our country. So what I'm hoping is that we are at a point now as people, not as Americans, not as Democrats and Republicans, but as people where we say it is now time for us to be humans together on the planet and to start making some choices that will help humans on the planet. And we've found one thing that's more important than profit, and that's humans and the ecosystems that they live in. And we've decided to save them, because to save them is to save ourselves. And that's the moment we're in. That is the moment of possibility that we're in. It's going to require all of us to actually say, I am not worth more than you. No matter what my education has told me, I am not worth more than you. And you are not worth more than me. Let's go at this together. And I think that's the possibility that we have in this moment.
Keep on clapping. That was amazing, and I feel like we could just keep clapping for the rest of the session. Yeah, choice, possibility, thinking about out of the box. I really appreciated the theme of responsibility. What are we responsible for at a national level, and how do we reckon with that moving forward? Also, really appreciated this point of what are we silent about, and what does that imply for what we're valuing? And in that spirit of kind of what we're silent about, Nadege, I'll turn to you. Some of our climate experiences have gotten a lot more attention than others, right? Here in Miami, for all of us who are local, there are households where when it floods out of their front door, given low-lying land on septic, it is contaminated waters that could give you sepsis. There are some remarkable students wandering the halls here who've been partnering with Catalyst and 60 households in the region to measure temperature levels and humidity levels indoors, and low-income households, low-wealth households in this region are experiencing temperatures indoors that should give you heat stroke, and we're working with them to figure out what does that mean for heat health action moving forward. So yeah, Nadege, what have we been silent about? What does that say about the cumulative burden? And yeah, what are the options, to Colette's point of, reimagining housing, reimagining investment in neighborhoods? Where could we be going?
I think we're silent about the people we don't want in the rooms that we're in, like this one, right? And so when we talk about the waterways, it's very white, as if black folks have not always been born of the water, right? And did not come out of the water, right? In Miami, we have many practitioners of traditional African religions, right? We have Santeria, we have Vodou, we have Candomblé, we have Yoruba, right? All the traditional African religions are practiced here. And the waterways are a very important ritualistic spot, right? And so who has access to the waters and who uses the water? It has always been all of us. And for some of us, it is very ancestral, the use of the water. To bathe, there is not a Caribbean person in Miami who has a body ache who will not tell you need to go to the ocean, right? Like every Jamaican in Miami, every Haitian, every African may be like, oh man, and they work very hard. And so their bodies hurt. So rest, radical rest often means go in the ocean, right? And so even interrogating who gets talked about when we talk about the ocean, right? No, we don't have waterfront mansions, but we put our bodies in the water. And there is a poop map in Miami. Shout out to my homie Rachel of Miami Waterkeeper, who always keeps us abreast of when there is poop in the water. And you cannot go into the ocean, right? And the folks who go into the ocean inland, it takes time, it takes gas, it takes resources to get to the water, right? Because it's not your backyard. And so you're actually spending money to get there. But you can't go inside of it because there is constantly some sort of sewage spill or leakage into our waterways. When we talk about the water coming in, we're also talking about the water coming up from under us, right? When you talk about the spongy ground, like this is porous. And so the water is coming in from under as well, right? The water table is rising. And many of our homes are built on septic tanks. In many of the black neighborhoods, it's all you have is septic tank. And okay, this is a quick primer on Miami-Dade County and municipal government. So if you're not from here, you just think you're in Miami or Miami Beach. We have some 32 cities here, all with their own mayors and government structure. So Miami-Dade County is the umbrella, right? The county, and there's a county government. But then there are municipalities, smaller cities within the county. There's Miami Shores, there's Miami Gardens, there's Hialeah, there's Homestead, there's Perrine. So these are all cities, own mayors, own police departments. And so this is not all one giant regional government that are all moving the same way. They're all moving in different ways. And they don't always like each other and they don't play well together most of the time, right? And so you have this big regional issue, but you also have within this body, you have state government, you have county government, but then you also have hyperlocal government and these smaller villages and cities here in Miami. And so when we talk about septic tank, and I'm always gonna go back to structural racism in Miami because that's where we're at, some cities are more well off because of taxes, right? So Coral Gables is more well off. Pinecrest is more well off. And some of those cities will be able to go out to bond in order to help those homeowners connect to sewer who have septic tanks, right? So they will take on that cost because they know that their tax income will be able to pay off this loan that the city will take for them to connect to sewer. Some cities will not be able to do that. Guess which ones? The ones where poor people are. And so for unincorporated Miami-Dade, for areas like Richmond Heights is a historical black neighborhood here. It's one of the first suburbs built for black veterans in all of the South. All of it is built on septic, but it's not a rich town. And so they probably won't be able to go out to bond to connect. And so what does that mean? As the water rises, your direct water is contaminated. It's not just the ocean and the beach. It's literally what's coming through your faucet. It is coming in through your bathtub. It is your child not being able to play outside because after they're in that moist dirt, they're gonna rub their eyes, they're gonna stick their fingers in their mouth. And so that is a very, very real health issue here in Miami that you don't hear about because it's not sexy. No one wants to talk about poop. You want to talk about the seas rising. But it is rising, right? And it also means that you're gonna have a lot of contamination in your direct backyard in a way that is not ambiguous, like it is yours, right? And it is all up in your house and with your children. And some areas will be better to, we always talk about resilience. And resilience means money, right? When we say resilient, we're talking about, do you have the means, the financial ability to fix it or mitigate it? In Miami, after a hurricane, for example, we are told, and New Orleans, same all across where folks are impacted by hurricanes, you need to be able to take care of yourself for 3 days before the government is gonna come in and help you because they gotta get their shit together, their stuff together. Sorry, I curse a lot, y'all. I'm from a newsroom. Journalists curse a lot. But they need to get their stuff together, right? They're not gonna be able to come out. The rapid response is your neighbors, right? That's rapid response after a hurricane. But also you're supposed to be able to fend for yourself. In Miami, if we're talking about resilience, we have to talk about economic justice. This is a low-wage town that is highly, highly built on hospitality and tourism. And even when you think about who has to go to work when the hurricane is coming, it is poor people. They don't get time off. In fact, after Hurricane Irma, we weren't devastated, right? It didn't flood, the buildings were standing after. However, FPL, shout out to FPL, the light went out and the power was off for about 2 weeks in some neighborhoods. People couldn't go to work because the power was out. And so hotels were saying, don't come in, right? A lot of these hospitality spaces were like, don't come in, we have no work for you. There is a direct correlation between those 2 weeks off of work and evictions 3 months later. And so those are the type of invisible type stories, the silence, right? Because you're fine. Like there are people who are like, oh, I can't go to work. The hotels are 40% off. I'm gonna go stay in a hotel on Miami Beach because the AC is still working. The power would never go out here, right? And so people had many vacations, staycations. Meanwhile, the people who worked at these hotels were getting evicted 3 months later because not having those 2 weeks of pay put them under in a way that they could not come back from. And so when we say resilience in Miami, and people like to go, la, 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 you want us to pay people more money. I'm like, but this is the same conversation. This is the same conversation. We recently passed a tenant bill of rights here in Miami. When we talk about silence, most people congratulate Miami-Dade County commissioners for passing that tenant bill of rights. But the women who agitated and fought for the tenant bill of rights to be passed were black and brown women, most of whom were hospitality workers, were LPNs, were caretakers. They were the ones who did that work at Miami Workers Center for a tenant bill of rights to be passed in Miami. But we also live in Florida where preemption is real. Every time there is a win, Tallahassee will figure out a way to take it away the next legislative session. So we also have to talk about policy. There are big local wins on a local level, but then when the legislature get involved, those wins become eradicated. Right now, there was a bill introduced 2 days ago around making it preempting landlords from letting renters know if the property that they're moving into floods. Right now in Osceola County, that is something that their local government is thinking of passing. But already Tallahassee is like, oh no. And so for renters in particular, and we are majority renters. Don't let people fool you. Most people here do not own a house. most folks here rent. And so we get protections, right? But the silence around the eradication of those protections on a statewide level, right? When you organize and you build on a local level, but you're not just dealing with local government, because you also have to deal with what happens and what comes down from Tallahassee. And preemption has been a very important tool here in Florida to take away a lot of the work happening around climate.
Thank you, Nadege. Can we get a round of applause? I think this theme of whose stories are being told and being heard is just profoundly important in the step back. So thank you. I'm going to pose one more question to both Jake and Susan, and then we'll have time for a question or two from the audience. We might have to run some sort of big competition because we won't have much time, so get ready to demonstrate your enthusiasm. So our last question here that I'll pose, when it comes to safe housing and a real estate market that is at least functioning, despite all of the issues we've been walking through, where a household can buy a home and rely on that to be wealth that will build through time and be passed down through the generations. Safe housing, real estate markets depend on a whole lot of pillars. Things like insurance, things like regulations, laws, policies, codes. There's a whole lot there that I think most of us who just live in a building don't really see or think about when it comes to the step back. So how do you see potential tipping points, for example, when it comes to insurance or other legal and institutional dimensions? And what are our opportunities for maybe doing better in buffering the transitions ahead, smoothing out the losses and damages as compared to just letting it be a big unexpected collapse?
Yeah, I can quickly talk about insurance. So in Florida, right, like windstorm insurance for hurricanes is provided by public companies, or private companies, excuse me, sort of. Over the last few years, more and more of these companies are pulling out of the market. They don't want to cover homes in Florida. So in a place like Miami, for instance, like I think the vast majority of homeowners in Miami get insurance through something called Citizens. It's the rickety public option, so to speak, in Florida. So you can, in Miami, you can sort of draw a map of the households that are most burdened by home affordability right now, and the households that are participating in this program because they don't have the resources to attract a coverage offer from a private carrier, right? So this is getting very, very expensive. And I think that, I think the way this functions right now in Florida, also in Tampa where I'm from, is as a kind of downward pressure that pushes people out of the ability to own a home and pushes them into the landscape of tenancy where, as Nadege said, there's very, very few protections, right? So in a place like Miami Gardens, right, one of the largest majority-minority cities in the country, I think, or at least in Florida, the largest in Florida, this is like a hotspot for this, right? Like 70-80% of people get windstorm insurance through Citizens of homeowners. And they also face this incredible burden of keeping up with their mortgage, right? So this is like an intersection that is like it's like an extra, very invisible financial pressure. This is an inland municipality that is not enjoying high elevations. And it's still, people there are still being pushed out because the collective burden of hurricane risk can't be borne by the existing financial structure that we've erected around it, right? So in terms of fixing it, right, the state legislature of Florida, surprise, surprise, has shown very little interest in stepping in to stabilize this program, which the costs are just continuing to rise, right? But you can look to something like California, right? They had a very, very similar problem with fire insurance, which is also included under a homeowner's insurance policy. And the state has had a really difficult time. They tried to step in and say, okay, you can't raise prices on people if they've just had a fire near them. You can't drop them from coverage. But they're in a war with these companies which want to get out, right? So I think that as with so much else, the conversation quickly goes beyond retreat, right? You quickly see that a managed retreat policy is not sufficient to fix the whole problem of insurance or of housing affordability. Because when people talk about managed retreat in Miami, I don't think Miami Gardens is on the top 10 list of municipalities that people think, oh, this is experiencing displacement pressure as a result of climate change, right? But you have to look at the whole picture, right? And that looks like provision of affordable housing. And I really think that managed retreat can never be successful until you stop looking at climate relocation policy and you start looking at housing policy. And that quickly goes all the way up the ladder, right? To the Public Housing Act, right? To the demolition of that program. And I think you really have to start there. And that's a lot easier said than done, obviously. But I think like you have to say it. I don't know.
And Susan, would you like to jump in on this? Yeah.
Look, for any insurance structure to work, it depends on distributed random risk across a large pool. The entire coastline of the United States is overvalued at this point because to the tune of $200 billion, because the risk signals, which the reinsurers know all about, have not made their way down to the marketplace. In Massachusetts, for example, there is no law requiring that flood risk be disclosed to a new buyer. Can you imagine? So, in fact, insurance is not the way we address this problem in the long term. Rather, it really does require a structural change in approach, a phase change in how we deal with assisting people. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I'm not really. In thinking differently about where and how we live over a period of decades. And it's going to be very important to actually decommission land that is subject to such a program so we don't end up with this radically unfair circumstance of a game of musical chairs in which a few developers on Hilton Head will just stay making as much money as possible. But much poorer communities 20 minutes away will be forced out. We can't do it that way. It has to be actually deliberately planned to decommission property and remove services. People who want to stay for their lifetimes should be allowed to stay. They may not get the same level of municipal services. That's the cruelty of it. But if you want to leave, we should make it possible to leave with a great deal of assistance. But insurance, it goes with risk. And right now, the risk is far higher than the premiums, and we're about to see something that's going to be more like a cliff than a slope for the residential real estate market in the United States, which will have global implications and be far worse than the 2008 financial crisis, because this is permanent. The value will never return. So the insurance industry knows this, the banks know it, everybody's shifting the buck. The banks say, not our problem, we shift our risk to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac say, not our problem. We've looked historically, everything seems fine. And it's just, it is bananas. And I'm worried that inevitably the impact of all of this refusal to discuss will fall heaviest on the shoulders of those who can take it the least, which is what we're talking about across this panel. So, we're not going to fix it here. We're not going to fix it here talking to each other. We really need to be very vocal in all the places where anybody listens.
And Katie, can I just jump in on that last point?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt the clapping. That was for you, friend. But we have this conversation. We talk about the role of government, and in South Louisiana, what is really clear is that the role of industry never comes into the conversation, and how much money they could be contributing to a very expensive process. I mean, why not get industry to pay for the damage? Why not actually just get them to pay taxes on their facilities? Because they're being exempted from taxes that get to that tax base, that get to all of these other things. There's all this financial burden coming down on people, but they're making billions a quarter. And they make billions over billions as the market goes. So I just wanted to bring in the role of accountability from industry as we're talking about this, all of these things that are needed at our community. There is actually a lot of money out there. It's just not with the people. It's with those multinational corporations that get billions of dollars a day from the destruction that then we have to deal with. And I think, they could play a little role in helping us get out of this thing.
Yep.